Okay, so first some background. What is 3D printing? 3D printing or additive manufacturing is an emerging popular technique of manufacturing that has the ability to create intricate, complex designs unlike traditional manufacturing. It is the construction of a three-dimensional object from a CAD computer-aided design model. And as a result, it is commonly used in many fields like medicine, aerospace, or dentistry. For example, orthodontists currently 3D print the retainers that many of us wear. Now, this manufacturing technique greatly differs from the traditional method or subtractive manufacturing. First of all, the concept of each technique is very different. As you can see in the picture on the bottom, additive manufacturing deposits material through a layer-by-layer process to produce product from the ground up, while subtractive manufacturing starts with raw material and removes excess material through milling, grinding, drilling, and other processes. As a result, subtractive manufacturing wastes much more material. However, it can handle a wider variety of materials, unlike 3D printing, and provides high precision and surface finish for its products. So it is used in mass manufacturing. But additive manufacturing is more common for prototypes and small production sizes, especially since it can effectively and quickly print custom, complex structured products. And now the applications of additive manufacturing. 3D printing broadens the horizon for the mechanical industry. Many biomedical devices, such as medical implants, for example, heart walls, are already being completely 3D printed. And 3D printing also brings in countless new possible designs. For example, its portability and convenience has allowed astronauts to experiment with space-based 3D printing, as shown in the picture in the right. And cheaper houses can be built by 3D printing the concrete. And even the food industry has utilized 3D printing to frost cakes and create plant-based meat. The materials used for 3D printing are polymers, ceramics, and metals. And the materials that burn instead of melt, such as wood, cloth, and paper, cannot be used because of the most common and affordable printing technique used, FDM, fused deposition modeling, or FFF, fused filament fabrication, which works by heating up the thermoplastic to melting point and extruding it out through a nozzle that traces the cross-section of each layer. Polymers, particularly ABS and PLA, are the most commonly used material for this. Which brings us to PLA, which is the most commonly used material for 3D printing and the material that we will be focusing on in our project. PLA, short for polylactic acid, is the thermoplastic polymer, and its chemical formula is C3H4O2, and the structure is shown in the top right picture. PLA is biodegradable since it is derived from biomass such as corn and sugarcane, and while ABS is made from fossil fuel derivatives such as petroleum. So that is the one difference between both the thermoplastics. And bulk PLA is produced in pellets via the polymerization process. And then these pellets are then heated and spun into filament, which is used by 3D printing. And in addition, the mechanical properties of 3D printed PLA is a very well-studied topic, particularly by the University of Perugia. But why does this matter? In order to understand the durability of the material, we need to understand its mechanical properties or its response to force or load. The most important mechanical property, and also the ones we'll be testing in our project, are hardness, the ability of a material to resist plastic deformation by indenting or scratching, ultimate tensile strength, which measures the maximum load a material can withstand before fracturing or breaking, the yield strength, which is its maximum stress applied before the shape permanently changes or plastic deformation begins, and then elastic modulus, which measures the material's elasticity, and lastly, ductility, which measures the ability to sustain plastic deformation without fracture. And this is done by drawing or pulling the material into a thin wire. And these can all be obtained by stress or strain tests, for the ultimate tensile strength, yield strength, and elastic modules and ductility. They can all be obtained by the tensile strength test shown in the right, and the hardness can be obtained by the hardness test.
Sample preparation. So this is currently what we're doing to prepare our samples. So as our traditional and control sample, we'll be creating injection molded parts, whereas our experimental samples will be 3D printed parts. So we modeled a dog bone sample in CAD according to the ASTM D638 standard, which just outlines the shape and size of our dog bone sample. Once we had our CAD, we exported the file to a slicer. Here we adjusted several sample properties, such as the infill density, layer orientation, wall thickness, and more. We've also created a CAD of our injection mold, which will be milled out of 6061 T6 aluminum stock, while our 3D printed samples will be printed from our Prusa Mark III from traditional filament feedstock. When we make our injection molded parts, they'll be cast from PLA pellets instead of the traditional filament feedstock. So we'll be measuring our samples in several ways, primarily through two machines, which include the tensile testing machine, which can produce a stress strain diagram, and it'll help us yield the following mechanical properties. We'll be able to find the ultimate tensile strength, yield strength, the Young modulus, and our ductility through the percent elongation. We'll also find our hardness through the Vickers Hardness test, which will basically measure the hardness of our samples, and we'll lastly use a microscope to observe the morphology of the fracture surface. Basically, we'll look at how the plastic fails, and after we've put the sample through the tensile machine. So currently, we've printed a 1 centimeter cube for our hardness test, and we've also printed 2 dog bone samples. And we've also created our computer-aided design for our injection mold.
Okay, so for our expected results, so we expect that the 3D printed samples will be inferior to traditionally manufactured samples across the board on all types of mechanical properties. This is based on the existing research. So that's also general knowledge. But even within 3D printed samples, they perform differently depending on the way they are created. So if you see down here, based on this data collected from the research stated below, those printed horizontally generally perform much better than the ones printed vertically. So we're expecting somewhere around 50% worse depending on the setup used. And vertically printed samples generally are worse because it relies on layer adhesion strength. All right, next. Okay, so another thing that we need to do is to decide on what to use as our baseline. So as outlined earlier, we will be planning to injection mold PLA, but if that doesn't work, we may consider machining it. And we also may consider testing ABS in the future because that does have more traditional use cases. Yep, next. Okay, but as stated earlier, so depending on the settings that we use during the printing, the samples can perform very differently. So we're going to have to work on how to reduce our variables. And so right now we're thinking about just printing using the same files and just using the same infill pattern, the same infill density, wall thickness. And what we're only going to change is the way we print it, which is just horizontally and vertically. And as you can see, that is it in the slicer. So you can see more or less how it's going to be printed. Next. So for our conclusion, so where we are at right now, so we currently have 2 Prusa 3D printers, and we will be printing in PLA. For our test, we will be using ASTM D638. And we haven't really decided on type 1 or type 5 test yet, but that will also be for the future. And for our hardness test, we will be using the Vickers Hardness test. And we're most likely going to injection mold our traditional samples. What we will be doing going forwards is we're going to figure out how to do our tensile tests, since we do not have a machine right now, and we have to decide on our standard test configuration. We also need to get the injection mold made. Next up. Okay, so making the injection mold is pretty complex because you have to machine the mold out of metal first, and that will 100% be outsourced. The CAD file is complete. We just have to work on getting it machined. Now, the standard tensile test is ASTM D638, and for these, the test machines are pretty expensive. So type 1, which is the larger test of the two, is actually cheaper. So that's around 20 to 30 grand a piece. So that's pretty expensive, and we're most likely going to outsource this process. So you guys can help us fundraise for our machine because this is really integral to our testing. So if you guys can, please donate. Next. So yeah, and that's our references basically. Next up. Next. Okay, thank you to ASDRP for enabling our research. Thanks to all parents for your support. Thanks to our Dr. Saracena for guiding us along our research. Thank you for listening to the presentations. And if you have any questions, you can ask them now.